Okay, so our group read After Dark, which is a novel about contemporary Japan and teenagers and that kind of stuff. And so the author really used a lot of cultural references, whether they're about Japan or coming from other countries within the novel. So we wanted to explore those cultural mentions and see how they actually pertained in real life contemporary Japan. So the novel takes place in Tokyo, and it's actually only set between the hours of midnight and 6 in the morning. And we believe that it occurred over only one night, the entire story. So the actual plot line is not very linear, and so you're kind of thrown around because partially there's two narrators, and these 2 points of view really dictate different views of these people in the story. And so we really go back and forth between reality and what's not real in this story, so a lot of the time it's difficult for the reader to decipher between the two. So basically, the characters all kind of are connected, and they have these random meeting points, and some of them actually meet on the page, and some of them we see references of them meeting in the past, or we see references of them maybe meeting in this alternate universe. So basically, it's really an obscure story, and there's no happy ending, there's no real closure, and it's up to the reader to kind of decide what the author was trying to get at. So it's really interesting, and a lot of the time there's no real conflict. There's just more internal conflicts with the characters, but there are a few external conflicts like the rape and other things like that. So, all right, so the author, Haruki Murakami, he is from Japan. He was born in Kyoto in 1949, which was a few years after World War II ended. So he was born right in the midst of this new Japan that was trying to reform and kind of get past the war. And in 1950, he actually moved to Aisha, which is a port in Japan, which had a lot of international influence. So he was really raised in not a super Japanese household. He was always out and about and was experiencing these other cultures. So we think that that's one of the biggest influences that he has on the story, and he himself even in a New York Times article was quoted saying that he feels like an outsider to Japan and to their culture. So it's kind of interesting. He became, as a teenager, he was really, really infatuated with detective novels and jazz music, which is a huge element in his story. He loves music, especially American music is referenced for a lot of the story. And he actually attended Waseda University in Tokyo and studied theater there. So that's kind of interesting, and he said that his parents did not want him to do that because he didn't follow the path that most Japanese teenagers did, where they entered the corporate world. So by studying drama there, he married his wife, I believe her name was Yoko, and then together they opened a jazz club called Peter Cat, which they opened and ran together for about 10 or 11 years, and then that's when he sold the club and began writing. His first novel was published in 1979, and then he continued writing and working on his books until he moved to Princeton, New Jersey in 1991 to become a researcher at Princeton University. And over the next 10 years, he kind of developed his career at Princeton, and he eventually became an associate professor there. And he did move back to Japan in 2001. So I don't know if he's currently living there. That was the most current information that I had. But so he's back living there and still writing, and as we know, he's published many, many novels, a lot of them having to do with this same ulterior universe in this world. So that is about him.
Okay, I'm going to discuss the important characters within the novel. The first character up there is Mari, and she's the first character that we're introduced to. We meet her in a Denny's, where she is sitting there reading a large textbook with no food or anything like that, so it's kind of a strange situation. Basically about Mari, she is a university student. She's around the age of 19 years old. She's very reserved. She thinks of herself as ugly and constantly kind of comparing herself to her older sister, who's been told that she was beautiful her entire life, so Mari's kind of always taking a second seat to that. She's a tomboy, she has short hair, wears baseball caps, and she also speaks Chinese, which is something that's very unique about her, and she's going to study different parts within Chinese because she wants to work as an interpreter later on in life. The next character that we're introduced to is Takahashi, and so he comes into the same Denny's and actually goes up and introduces himself to Mari. He recognizes her as her older sister's younger sister, and he says they actually went on a date one time. It was like a double date that they went on a couple of years ago. But so Takahashi, he plays the trombone. He's very interested in music and in law. He's very talkative and outgoing, and that's why he was, the one that went up to Mari at the beginning. He has a connection to Mari, Eri, and Karu. And then we later on in the book find out that his mother died young and his father was in prison. So he kind of always thought of himself as an orphan type person because at such a young age he was responsible for taking care of himself. Then there is Eri, and so this is Mari's older sister, the one that's beautiful. She worked in fashion for a little bit. She was a model. Her parents always fawned all over her, and she was the Snow White type character, the typical older sister that you have to look up to. And she has a problem. Not only does she have a lot of allergies, it's always had her been very protected and sheltered her entire life, whereas Mari's kind of the opposite and was able to go out and do whatever she wanted to because she didn't have these exact same problems. But we also soon find out in the book that she's been asleep for about 3 months, and they said that she, not asleep completely in a coma, but she actually gets up and will eat food secretly in her room, but she still has stayed and remained in her room asleep for 3 months, which is kind of strange, and that's a huge thing that ties her along. But we do see her in different mediums throughout the book, in different almost type of realities. She's not in the normal reality as the other characters are. Then we meet Karu, and so she is a former professional wrestler. And how we meet her is she goes into the same Denny's where Mari and Takahashi were after learning that Mari speaks Chinese because she has a problem and needs someone who can interpret Chinese for her to help them figure this out. She's the manager, of the Alphaville Love Hotel. So basically Love Hotels are hotels people go to in Japan, have sex with people. You'll learn about this later on in the presentation when we discuss prostitution and sex and all that fun stuff. And she's very stocky and big and not described as attractive. Then there is Kamugi, and basically she's just kind of a supporting character in this, and she's kind of just a tag along with Karugi and Karu, and she is a redhead. She has, again, short hair, she had a lot of piercings, and she works at the Alphaville Love Hotel as well, and she does a lot of cleaning and maid service type of work. And then there is Karugi, and so we're introduced to Karugi at the same time we are as Kamugi, which is kind of confusing because their names are very similar. And so, from first reading it, you think these characters are kind of the same baseline, but then later on you realize that there's a lot more to Karugi than meets the eye. And she actually used to work in a very professional company in Osaka, and then some event after the Kobe earthquake occurred left her shattered and having to run away from these type of people who are branding her and hurting her. So she's kind of living this constant on-the-run type of thing where she feels no full safety. And then lastly, we have our character Shirakawa, and so this is the man who goes to the Love Hotel frequently, and he has a flavor for Chinese, not the food, Chinese people actually, and is constantly going there and meeting up with Chinese prostitutes and things like this. And so he actually is the one that beats up this Chinese prostitute and is connected then to all the characters from the Alphaville because this is who they're looking out for in the bad sense that they're looking for him.
The setting of the novel is in Japan. It's actually in Tokyo, which is known as the capital city of Japan. But
You're gonna have to move over so we can
Okay,
see you on the camera.
Tokyo is also the most populous metropolitan city in the world. Japan has a population of around 126 million, 13 million of which live in Tokyo. But more specifically, After Dark is set in Tokyo during the hours between sundown and sunup. And this is Tokyo at night, and it's the scene that most of the characters are experiencing during the time of the novel.
Okay, so for our thesis, we wanted to explore the social norms and lifestyles of those living in contemporary Japan, and specifically in relation to prostitution, violence, and westernization. specifically with food and music, and we wanted to look at how these topics would relate to the novel. So first, we're going to talk about prostitution in Japan, and obviously the novel examines prostitution through the love hotels or the Alpha Hotel throughout the entire novel. And Shirakawa is the one who makes the most frequent visits to the Alpha Hotel. Takahashi reveals in the novel that he actually took a girl to a love hotel at one point, and Mari obviously is involved in decoding an act of violence within the hotel. So early prostitution in Japan, it's been prevalent throughout their history, and it actually started in the 15th century with Chinese, Korean, and Eastern Asians would visit Japan specifically for their brothels in Tokyo. That's mostly what Japan was known for in the 15th century was their brothels. But in the 16th century, European and Portuguese traders would come to Japan and actually be involved with the sex trade, and they would basically take young women and girls who were involved in sex slavery in Japan, take them back to their countries and sell them into sex trafficking and that sort of thing. But after World War II, Japan established anti-prostitution laws, and this said that no one was to be involved in prostitution, whether you were a prostitute or a customer. But because there were some liberal interpretations and basically loose enforcement of the law, there was a lot of loopholes, and the main loophole that Japan is known for are their love hotels, which is obviously the most prominent way we see prostitution throughout the novel. So what a love hotel is, it's just a short stay hotel for the basic purpose of allowing couples to practice sex privately. And this was widely adopted after World War II when they first abolished prostitution. And these were most prominent in Tokyo, where the story takes place. And the law states that it's prohibited to sell or buy sex, but it doesn't penalize those acts. And we see this in the novel with Shirakawa when he's caught on tape after being in the Alpha Hotel, but once the tapes are given up, he's never penalized for his actions, which is basically what the law states in contemporary Japan. And what it does penalize is those prostitutes who are soliciting in public or waiting for a customer in public, and penalizes anyone who forces someone to engage in prostitution or exploits a prostitute, and also penalizes those who financially are giving money to companies that are engaged in prostitution. Okay, so some statistics of prostitution in Japan. In 2000, there were over 5,425 registered fashion health parlors. And what these mean to us, I guess, would be like a massage, spa type of place. And basically, they're known places that are registered where you can go to receive sexual favors. So that's a pretty large number. In 1998, it reported 945 billion yen was made through amateur prostitution, and I think this is about $9 billion US. I think that was the equivalent. And more recently, Japan has operated on telephone clubs for prostitutions, and what this is basically a club where young girls go to, and there would be a bunch of telephones with men in the back, and they could pick up the phone and call any number that they would find, and they could say how tall they are, like what they look like, their size, I don't know, all of that. And the men will like offer to meet them somewhere outside of the club or in the back of the club. And this was a more recent survey that 25% of high school girls had admitted to calling or been in a telephone club at least once. And also, most sources that I found had quotes from young girls that had been engaged in like amateur prostitution, and they weren't ashamed of their actions or anything, but they were actually proud that they were making money for themselves, not relying on their families. So overall, Murakami really brought out the theme of prostitution through the love hotels, specifically to reflect modern-day Japan as how sex really is seen in day-to-day life. and that's seen with Shirakawa and how it's incorporated into his everyday life and how it's more like a casual thing when he goes to the Alphaville, sorry, I keep saying Alpha Hotel. And it's also sort of an irony that Murakami brought about because the laws say that they inhibit prostitution, but no one is going to be penalized for doing so, and that's seen through the book through Shirakawa as well, when he was never penalized for being caught on tape. Go ahead, sorry.
Okay, so I'm going to be talking about violence in After Dark, and it really isn't mentioned that much. It is a large theme of the book, however, when we do see it, it's usually in details, like you can see in this quote. This is from when Shirakawa, the man who beat up the Chinese prostitutes, in his home, and he can't sleep, and the TV's on in the background. And Murakami gives us just a brief glimpse of what the TV is saying, and in that we get this violence of a mother killing herself and her children, but it's kind of just shoved in between a mention of yin declining, Christmas shopping. So this is how we get most of the instances of violence, where they're just kind of put into the story. So you see them, but they're more of a backdrop. However, there are some really major instances of violence and crime really weaving its way into the main plot. And these are the three major ones. It's violence against women, illegal immigrants, and gangs. And I will discuss these later in detail. This is also, I feel like it's a parallel to Japanese life, with the kind of the crime not being mentioned that much, because Japan does have a really low rate of crime. And you can really see this if you compare the statistics of Japanese crime to statistics in America, which I will do next. Japan is a very highly developed and densely populated nation, and criminologists really link this with a rising crime rate. However, Japan really seems to be immune to this trend. If you look at them compared to America, there's a table here, but if you look at the total violent crime, you can see that for 100,000 people, in Japan there's only about 17 people who really had pretty violent crimes happen to them, but in America it's around 684 per 100,000. And these numbers are extremely different. This is a kind of old graph, however, with my next slide, it'll tie in because these are the numbers from 2007, and if you did look at the numbers from Japan for the last one, they really haven't changed at all. So Japan is actually, it's a really safe country. I mean, as you can see by the stats. I lived in Japan for 9 months, and for example, my friends and I, we'd go out, say on a bus or on a train or something, and say we're coming back early in the morning, the first train back, 5 o'clock in the morning, not completely sober, and we leave our wallet or our phone on the bus. Usually in America, if you forget that, it's gone. But in Japan, the train station will either email you or mail you, or you can call them, and they'll usually be yeah, we have your wallet, somebody brought it in. So people will actually just bring this stuff and they won't take it. However, the most common crime in Japan is bicycle theft. Around 300,000 bicycles were stolen in 2007, or reported stolen. Also umbrella theft. Umbrellas are stolen all the time, but they're not reported because there'd be way too many reports. There are a lot of, there are some serious offenses. These are the ones that are labeled as violent crimes by Japanese law. And again, you can just see they really haven't changed that much from 1995. And if you add all these together, out of the entire population of Japan, which is over 120 million people, this only adds up to around 16,000. So only about 16,000 of those 120 million have really experienced these violent crimes. So back to crime, violence, and After Dark. Again, it's more of the backdrop for the story. But next I'll be talking about the three major crimes that really play a large role in the plot. And these again are violence against women, which we have the Chinese prostitute who is brutally beaten up by Shirakawa. We also have illegal immigration. There's a lot of allusions that the Chinese prostitute and some of the members of the Chinese gangs did not enter the country legally. And then also there's mention of gangs. There's a large mention of Chinese gangs, including the triads, And then there's some mentions of the Yakuza, which are the Japanese gangs. First, I'll look at violence against women. And in the novel, we have the Chinese prostitute who is beaten by Shirakawa, who is a businessman. We're never really told the exact reason why he beats her up, but she is covered with like bruises and blood when they first see her, and you get pretty much a good grasp of the situation by this quote. And while it isn't really a lot of like mention of this, she's really the only instance. It is insinuated that this does frequently happen. The manager of the Love Hotel, Kaoru, she states that they can't call the cops because she's probably an illegal alien and that she doesn't have time to testify like every time something like this happens. So this probably happens pretty frequently. And in reality, I looked at a study on intimate partner violence in Yokohama, which is located in Tokyo. While this doesn't really deal with prostitutes, it does draw a lot of parallels with violence against women. The study really concluded that by the age of 49, around 1 in 5 women had experienced intimate partner violence, and around 4% of them had sustained injuries from this. Most had experienced these early on in life, like the Chinese prostitute. And this chart shows that the probability of having experienced violence, it really drastically increases like the older the woman becomes. And there are legislations against this type of violence. However, it doesn't pertain to couples that aren't married. So for these non-married couples, like the women, there's really no way for people to help them. Next, I'm looking at illegal immigration. And again, it's heavily alluded that some characters are illegal immigrants. For example, with the prostitute, again, Koto states that she can't call the cops because she's probably an illegal alien. And then later on, when she's talking to the prostitute, she tells her, you came all the way from China and you probably like snuck into Japan. So it is very probable that the prostitute is an illegal alien. The Chinese gang, it's never really mentioned if they're illegal aliens. However, they are sneaking in women from China, so it's not a far stretch to believe that they are sneaking in gang members. And my statistics later will show that in reality that does happen a lot, that a lot of these gang members are illegal aliens. So in reality, there's an estimated 200,000 illegal immigrants in Japan, and they're mostly from other Asian countries. Around 40,000 of these do come from China. For entering the country, 3/4 of illegal aliens, they enter Japan with a valid visa, and then after like their visa is up, they usually just stay there illegally. The kinds of jobs they would get, men usually work as construction workers, cooks, and kitchen helpers, and the women usually work in bars or as waitresses and factory workers, or they can get jobs as prostitutes. They usually do this to pay off their debts from being stuck into the country. This is probably what has happened to the Chinese prostitute. There's also gangs, and while this isn't really a job, a lot of Chinese do illegally immigrant in association with gangs. They're considered heavily armed and dangerous by the Japanese police. And this will lead us to a last instance of violence, which is gangs. In the novel, there are 2 different groups mentioned again, the Yakuza, the Japanese gangs, and the Chinese gangs. The Yakuza are really only briefly mentioned in this one quote, and it says that compared to these Chinese gangsters, Chinese Yakuza are sweethearts, and most of the emphasis of the novel is on the Chinese gangs. Now the Chinese gangs, it's mostly, I think, the triads, but Kaoru is talking about if they do hand over the picture of Shirakawa to this gang, what will happen? And she says like the gang probably won't kill him because he's kind of a respectful Japanese guy. However, they are going to be very violent with him. They'll probably beat him up or like cut off an ear. And this is insinuated really is not an idle threat either, because later on in the story, Shirakawa has taken a cell phone from the prostitute and he discards it, and Takahashi gets the cell phone and he receives a call from the Chinese gangs, and it basically states that you might forget what you did, but we will never forget. You will never get away. And this is meant for Shirakawa, but it's it's insinuated that he really is not going to get away and that they are going to do something violent to him. The Yakuza, for the reality, they're a Japanese crime syndicate, kind of like the mafia, and there's around 22 Yakuza groups with over 85,000 members. They're traditionally involved in like protection schemes, gambling, and sexually oriented rackets such as prostitution. And the authorities like generally ignore the activity. They tend to believe that if they let them operate openly, then they can keep a better eye on them. Sort of feeling like of a necessary evil. And while these gangs like, are criminals and they do a lot of like criminal activities, they're very bad. They do help out some, like during the Kobe earthquake of 1995 and the more recent tsunami in 2011. They were one of the first ones to arrive on the scene, and they actually distributed food, water, and they gave people shelter before the government did anything. However, they're still dangerous criminals, but this does kind of lead to the quote from Kaoru with saying that the Yakuza were like sweethearts compared to these Chinese gangs. Last are the Chinese gangs in reality, and like most of the gangsters who cause the sort of violence that really make the news headlines in Japan are actually parts of like smaller street gangs. However, there are some groups that have come over from mainland China, such as the Triads, which are mentioned in the book. They're an organized crime syndicate, but they are pretty decentralized. They're like the Yakuza, they're involved in prostitution, gambling, and fencing stolen goods, and this sometimes leads to conflict with the Yakuza. They've actually become a lot more bold during the last decade, and the reports of certain members actually gunning down high-ranking officials of the Yakuza, and the Yakuza usually aren't messed with, so we can see that they're really gaining power and that they are pretty violent.
I just need to remind you that you got about 6 minutes total left for your whole presentation.
Okay. Well, this is like
So you might need to, go quickly through this.
I'll end right here. So in conclusion, crime really does exist in Japan, but as the novel shows, it just stays in the background, and there's almost like a wall between the criminal world and the rest of the world. And we really get a sense that there's two separate worlds, and like what I've been discussing with this quote from Takahashi after he's gotten this phone call. He states that this is one of just the many violent acts being performed in secret on the hidden side of the city, and they're things from another world, like that are in a different circuit. And it really, this statement really provides a final push that kind of places this violence as a hidden background detail in the novel, but also in paralleling real world Japan.
Okay, I'm going to talk about two common themes that are in the novel. And the first one about that is music, which can be seen throughout the novel in many different instances, and also a lot of the characters are very into music, which is shown from Murakami's interest in music as well. And the second one is that throughout the entire novel, there is this like presence of a camera, and so then I'm going to talk about different cinematography in Japanese films and how it relates to the entire way that the novel is written. Okay, so to begin, to begin, I'm going to talk about a little bit about the history of the westernization of the music in Japan. So it began in 1549 when Jesuit missionaries came over into Japan, and they kind of had their influence on the leaders of Japan in the religion of Christianity. So that brought about the liturgical music, so that was the first kind of music that was there. And then in 1612, however, it took a shift, and there was a different government going under power, and from 1612 and then until 1868, there was a suppression and prohibition of the Western culture completely. So it was all Japanese. This is when we have our traditional Japanese culture in there, and that's the westernization is completely out. However, in 1868, the Tokugawa government came into power, and then this is when they invited different musicians from all over the world, and specifically in Europe and the United States, to come over there. And they begin to have people come over there and begin to teach music classes within their elementary schools. And so that's around the 1880s when the music teachers came into their elementary schools. And I think one of the first music teachers that was in there was actually from Boston. So it's interesting that they came from the United States and were teaching over in Japan. And then in 1945, there's this thing called enkan. So this is basically a traditional kind of Japanese music that still is around today, but it's kind of a lot more common in older Japanese people, not really as the young people, but it is the most popular Japanese type of music that's still around. The 1960s is then after when the westernization shift came to Japan. And by the 1970s, there was lots of pop artists in Japan singing songs that were both a mix of English and Japanese. And so this is kind of when the westernization of music came to the forefront in their country. Okay, there actually was a study then that they did about Japanese music and their preferences. And I thought it was really interesting, so it relates so much to the novel because it actually was done with students at the university, and they were 19 years old, so I thought that was interesting because it's the exact same age that Mari is in the book. And so but the study was studying the music preferences and personality among Japanese university students. So they began by having 8 genres listed, so pop, J-pop, rock, jazz, hip-hop, rap, metal, classic, punk, and reggae. Many of them which we see actually in the novel as well. All right, so out of the 268 students that were taken from 2 Tokyo-based universities, again, the average age was 19.3. They had to rank their preference in music by genre, the same genre I just showed, and they also had to complete a generic personality test then as well. They reported spending 1.8 hours listening to music, and the most favorite was pop, and the least favorite was metal. And it's interesting, these two were the huge music types that we see in After Dark. These are the 2 main kind of genres we see. And so classical music, basically what the study found then, those who favored classical music had different personality traits attributed with an appreciation for the aesthetics and inquisitiveness. And those who favored jazz music had an aesthetic appreciation, creativity, and unconventionality. And I thought this was so interesting because, as we know, Takahashi was really interested in jazz. And he was really creative and all these things. He was unconventional. And just that this is almost the novel kind of explains all 3 of these things. It has the aesthetic appreciation, it has creativity, and it has a lot of unconventionality. And then, so this is about contemporary music then within Japan and the Western influence. So today, a lot of Japanese artists tend to sing in both English and Japanese. They also tend to take a stage name that's an American or an English stage name. And they also tend to mimic the style, lyrics, and presentation that we see today here in the United States as well. So for hip-hop type songs, which is a popular genre of music for them, are we out of time?
2 minutes.
Okay. So for hip-hop things there, they have very similar beats. Oh, wait, sorry. So hip-hop, they have similar beats, vocal styles, lyrics, image, and stage presence. Women kind of mimic Christina Aguilera and Beyonce, whereas men mimic 50 Cent and Lil Jon. Some similar themes with the lyrics, and then they're kind of about emotional love, sexual relations, and gender pride. And they also have found a similarity with this within rock, too. Again, they stage the same kind of attitude, I guess, that we think of our rock stars today. They dress kind of grungy, and they would pose with the guitars. They'd act, like the typical stereotype of a rock star. They have the exact same thing over in Japan. And then there's also a Japanese influence as well, and so they have 2 popular types of music that we don't have over here, and one of them is Visual Kei, and so this can be described as a mixture of heavy metal and hardcore punk. And so basically the thing that's interesting about this is that their songs are writing about a variety of things. One of the things I thought was really interesting was the Japanese supernatural world, which is something that I guess is very important in their culture, and we see it in a lot of different things in their culture, and which I think explains a lot of the reasons why there's that whole supernatural element in After Dark as well. But so basically this kind of music, the Visual Kei, the entire thing is to get this like shock value. So they'll do like androgynous dressing and dress up in strange costumes. Their music is still pretty much normal, but they just are always trying to kind of shock their audience with how they dress and things like that. And I think now our culture is tending to kind of like, we're almost shaping to that more now with people like Lady Gaga and things like that, but these were the originators of this type of style. And the second type of one we see is cutesy music, and so this is a mixture of bubblegum pop and children's music, and I think this is kind of the stereotype that we might sometimes have towards Japan. I know this is like kind of like little Japanese schoolgirl with the big eyes and like so happy, like Hello Kitty type things. And so this basically is a mix between the innocent child and also a sexual undertone in their things. And this is a huge phenomenon in Japan currently. It's been around for like 20 years. But that I think this is how we typically view Japanese music. So this is how they keep, this is their cultural influence of music. And are we?
Yeah, you have to go still?
Yes.
You're gonna have to cut, you're gonna have to stop at this point.
Okay.
Let her-
Okay. All right, so I really focused on the culinary culture within After Dark and also in contemporary Japan because Murakami mentions multiple times there's a few different American and Western fast food locations. The two he specifically mentions are Denny's and 7-Eleven. But there's also some other elements of culinary culture from Japan and other places in the world because he talks about food politics in a few different parts of the novel. And there's also some generic food choices within the novel as well. So we thought that they were pretty relevant because pretty much every time that Mari and Takahashi meet or talk, it's usually over food or in a restaurant. So, all right. So first, I wanted to talk about traditional Japanese cuisine. But so basically, they have always been known to have a really, really healthy diet, and this is mainly because of their low fat, low protein, and high HDLs. And so the low fat comes from they're constantly eating vegetables, and they only lightly steam them, even though deep frying is an option. They typically tend to steam them and just leave them how they are. They have a very low protein diet because they don't typically eat animal products other than fish, which is huge in Japan, and that leads to the high HDLs, which are high-density lipoproteins, and also omega-6 fatty acids, which are extremely healthy for you, and they reduce your risks of heart disease and all kinds of other health issues. So the Japanese have had this huge thing, and we all know sushi and hibachi and meals like that to be typical in Japan, but some of them have bad dietary cons as well because of the increase in processed foods. As we're going to talk about some more, fast food is becoming huge in Japan. Refined sugars with all the rice that they eat, it doesn't have much dietary value. As we know, white bread is nowhere near as good for you as a piece of whole wheat bread. And also, they have really high sodium content because of soy sauce and other things like that.
Okay, you've been on for 37 minutes, and we have 2 more groups, so you're going to have to quick slice to
Okay.
your conclusion. I'm sorry.
To the group conclusion?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Okay, so our final conclusion is that after comparing the different pieces of After Dark to real research about contemporary Japan and their society, we found that there are a lot of consistencies as well as inconsistencies in Japan. For instance, Hannah talked about how the book seems to portray Japan as a much more violent place, while in reality it's an extremely safe city, Tokyo is. Tori talked about the relevance of American music, which is very, very noted in the novel, and they don't usually talk about the Japanese influence of music in the novel, which is still very prevalent in Japan. Juliana talked about the prevalence of love hotels, which are pretty big in Japan, but they're not the only type of prostitution. And then for me, I was planning on talking about the relevance of fast food and how they've really westernized Japanese culture, which the novel really goes into, but they don't talk about Japanese food culture much, which is still extremely relevant in Japan.
Okay, thank you. So that was a total of 39 minutes. So